a recent book called Science and Myth, What We Are Never Told, Wolfgang Smith actually begins by examining the term myth. Okay? And it's a very, very helpful and instructive exploration to help us to see, okay, how did we in some sense get here? What is going on with this polyvalency or multiple definitions? Science and myth, the two need to be looked at. So I'll read you a brief excerpt so that we can orient ourselves. He says that science, according to the prevailing wisdom, constitutes usually for us the antithesis or opposite of myth. So very often we talk about something scientific and then we talk about the mythical. As Albert Einstein has famously said, science deals with what is, in which case I guess myth has to do with what is not. But it turns out that the matter is not quite so simple. In the first place, it happens that science does not refer purely to what is. So even in the case of physics, for example, it's not simply nature that it speaks of, but the responses on the part of nature to our or the physicists' strategies of experimental physics. So it's not simply dealing with what is, okay, but it refers more to a participatory universe. So there's a disconnect, therefore, between what science itself affirms and what one generally understands to be the scientific worldview. In word, the so-called scientific worldview turns out, in a certain sense, to be itself a myth. Now he turns to the word myth. He says we tend to be equally confused regarding the nature and function of myth itself. We forget that far from dealing simply with what is not, authentic myth, quote, embodies the nearest approach to absolute truth that can be expressed in words. Again, authentic myth, he says, far from dealing with what is not, meaning what is not real, quote, embodies the nearest approach to absolute truth that can be expressed in words, as Ananda Kumaraswamy points out. So he's quoting the great Sri Lankan scholar Ananda Kumaraswamy. And there you see the tension already, right? So myth taken as the opposite of science, which claims to be true and real, versus myth as what some say is, again, it's worth really, quoting again and again and again, embodies the nearest approach to absolute truth that can be expressed in words. So what is going on here? How can it be that this has happened? In this text, Wolfgang Smith tries to clarify what is going on here for us. And I'll quote another brief excerpt before moving on. He tries to basically clarify the nature and function of authentic myth, but also talks about three modern myths that have emerged. So he speaks about the Newtonian myth of mechanism, the Darwinian myth of evolutionism, and then the Copernican myth of space at large. And he says that these are presiding paradigms that, even though they are very problematic and there are many challenges to them, and in a certain sense have been disproved, nevertheless, culturally and civilizationally, they continue to be believed in. Okay, so as paradigms that orient, these are orienting stories which are being told, these, in some sense, are prevailing myths, perhaps in the non-authentic sense. And Wolfgang Smith here also begins to call them anti-myths to help to clarify the matter. So he says that his major point is that these myths of science each in their own distinctive way, militate against the perennial and indeed the sacred wisdom of mankind. Now, the perennial and sacred wisdom of mankind, often communicated in the religious traditions that we have, present themselves also through myths. Okay? And when we go towards that to explore this a bit further, my second stop is now going to be René Guénon. So my good friend Sidi Said Idrisi, who was participating in Sidi Temur's book circle, the book club on the reign of quantity, he visited a few days ago, and I had to ask him about this, about myth and mythology. And there is an early essay by Guénon in the 1920s called Myth and Symbol in the French. So I'm not sure if it has been translated. Sidi Temur, I don't know if you happen to know where this text appears in the English, but I simply had a copy of the French given to me. But it is quite helpful. And I'll just mention a brief point again to clarify the whole question of myth. Guénon contends that myth is in a sense a symbolic narrative. That means a narrative which essentially is a subcategory of a symbolic quest, a quest that involves the sacred knowledge of symbolism. And when he looks at the etymology or the linguistic root, but also, let's say, ontological, it's bound up. When he looks at the etymology or root of myth, something remarkable happens. He says that already in the ancient Greek world, a kind of deviation was entering into the scene in terms of what myth means. So we're not the first ones, when we look at the responses we gave, to have different, of course, opinions about this. He says that even in the ancient Greek world, they themselves had a variety of perspectives. So on the one hand, aesthetic fantasy, so a kind of literary fantasy, he says, creeped in, so that the poets also brought in some elements of their own opinion and imagination. And this was already a kind of deviation from the original sacred sense of myth as a phenomenon and as a word. Originally, he says, it was a symbolic account or report. Let's say a witness account or report that is presented in symbolic mode. When we talk about different languages, for example, even in the German, when you talk about a narrative, you say Erzählung, and zählen means to count, and we often talk about recounting. But of course, when we talk about counting, very often we think of number or quantity, whereas recounting is, in a certain sense, of course, also remembrance. And Guénon is pointing to this notion as well, that this is fundamental to the original. He goes to the etymology and he shows that it goes to the Latin muthos and further back to the Greek muein, which is a verb which means to close the mouth and to close the lips and to be quiet and to close sometimes even the eyes and to enter into silence. And therefore he says that it is connected to a journey which is very often initiatic. It has to do with initiation, so that one leaves lots of the associations which one might have and enters into a center of silence. And in that silence, when one detaches and closes off the external, then there is a certain kind of speech or a certain kind of narrative which is then told. Now the Greeks, because of some of the poets, he says, in some sense introduced some aspects of their own fantasy and imagination, and therefore it was, even in the time of the Greeks, a bit mixed up. But in its pure originality, it has to do again with a journey towards silence, where one is opened to something of a higher nature. He further also states that one key element is that it is always suggestive. There are signs that point you onwards. So ayat, there are always signs that are not quite graspable simply at the rational level, which means I can stay home or I can stay somewhere and not journey, but something that in a certain sense exceeds the rational. So we heard suprarational and supernatural from some of the respondents, and in a certain sense is always suggestive, he says. It reveals a certain aspect, but then it hides itself again, and you can never quite capture it, but you can in a certain sense perhaps open up and submit to it. So it is a different kind of intelligence. Narratival, mythical intelligence, perhaps, therefore, is something of a different nature than a reduced rationalism, where I can stay there and grasp everything very easily. He also talks about hierarchy, so that one is led upward, therefore. These are some of the elements that perhaps help to set up the conversation here in terms of the background of this term. The scholars of modern mythology in the West, when you actually look at what they have done and how they have approached things, I just took a look at this book, a very short introduction, to myth, and it is remarkable that the vast majority of them do not really deal with any of this. So it is more of a rationalist, I should say, approach to reducing everything to a very graspable mode, but never setting out on a journey towards higher meaning. Guénon also connects the word myth to mystery and mysticism. Okay, so these are some of the elements perhaps that lie in terms of the etymology of this very term and everything perhaps that it involves. And as we saw, Wolfgang Smith is contending that one of our challenges is that when these original accounts, which are meant to lead us inward and upward, are ignored and forgotten and taken to be as mere fantasy and as fake, of course, there has to be something which claims that it is the real and it is the true. And this role has been played in the modern world by science, which has its own narratives and stories and paradigms. And as we saw, 3 of them come together to present a different kind of myth, which calls itself true. So now we're talking about a kind of contention, let's say a battle of different kinds of myths. Why should this be of any interest to us? This is our first task. Why myth? Why do we even need to talk about this? For me, at least, it is not particularly, I think, interesting or fascinating just to talk about it as some kind of academic discipline. There is much more here that is at stake. And perhaps we should be aware of some of the dangers. And for that, I simply wish to share another brief excerpt with you, just to show you why it is so important, for example, to return and to go back to what Dr. Zamir has given us. Because if you just read it, maybe for some of you at least, it seems like, well, I already know this. I mean, yeah, this is something that perhaps I've grown up with. So what's the big deal? So the appreciative intelligence of appreciating why it is so necessary, I think, is the starting point. Why is it necessary? Well, because if we do not understand true, authentic myths of the authentic traditions, we may very easily be deceived into moving in a direction where those things which claim to be authentic or real get the better of us. So let me just share a brief excerpt of a book. So please listen to this and try to see what you think this is based on. And for me, it was, of course, shocking, but we have heard a lot of warnings, perhaps, from those of a perennialist background about some of these dangers. I just shared Guénon's perspective and Wolfgang Smith, but take a listen to this. Recently, a book was published by a professor at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His name is Christopher Preston. The title of the book is called The Synthetic Age. Subtitle, Out-Designing Evolution, Resurrecting Species, and Re-Engineering Our World. The summary. He says, we have all heard that there are no longer any places left on Earth untouched by humans. The significance of this goes beyond statistics documenting melting glaciers and shrinking species counts. It signals a new geological epoch or age. In the synthetic age, what is most startling about this coming epoch is not only how much impact humans have had, but more important, how much deliberate shaping they will start to do. Emerging technologies promise to give us the power to take over some of nature's most basic operations. It's not just that we are exiting the Holocene, but entering an age called the Anthropocene. It is that we are leaving behind the time in which planetary change is just the unintended consequence of unbridled industrialism. A world designed by engineers and technicians means the birth of the planet's first synthetic age. So Preston describes a range of technologies that will reconfigure the Earth's very metabolism, nanotechnologies that can restructure the natural forms of matter, molecular manufacturing that offers unlimited repurposing, synthetic biology's potential to build, not just read, a genome, biological mini-machines that can out-design evolution even, the relocation and resurrection of species, and climate engineering attempts to manage solar radiation by synthesizing a volcanic haze, cooling surface temperatures by increasing the brightness of clouds, and remove carbon from the atmosphere with artificial trees that capture carbon from the breeze. Okay? Now, when you get this kind of emerging modern scientific vision of how a so-called better future looks like, perhaps one of our tasks is to ask ourselves, well, what is going on here, and what is the basis of this? What is the vision? What is the ideology on which these kinds of efforts are based? Certainly, they must be based on a certain worldview or Weltanschauung. And this is exactly what Wolfgang Smith wants to make us aware of, that if we do not examine the underlying vision and premises of how we do things and what we do and why we do them, we very easily fall prey. And of course, if these things are advertised as offering a so-called better world, we will follow it. So having said that, I would like, first of all, to ask you if that was understandable in terms of looking at the way in which myth itself very often gets confused, and how in the name of authentic myths, other ideologies come about which give us these kinds of visions. Because that, in some sense, perhaps awakens us to the need of why we need to, in some sense, go back and re-examine the authentic myths so that our discernment will become greater, and why it is necessary to do so, and then perhaps we can appreciate what is there in what Dr. Zamir is giving us. Are there any questions with regard to this first opening of this idea concept of myth, the pseudo or anti-myths that are now parading around, and the need to go back. Any particular questions or comments at this point? The question of how all of these things can happen in the first place, for example, deviations in the reality of myth itself, very often is connected to a form of reductionism where one aspect of a phenomenon is taken as the whole. So philosophically speaking, we're talking about the one and the many. And if you imagine, there can be multiple relationships, there can be different relationships. When you take any person, for example, there are multiple relationships and multiple aspects that you have, of course, in your life. But what if we took one of them? What if we took your professional role? Or what if we took only your family relationships as the whole of your being? For example, you would only be a mother, or you would only be a student, or you would only be an engineer. Of course, we see that we have multiple dimensions of our one identity. And to some extent, this is the core reason behind why the pseudo-mythologies have arisen in the modern period. But having looked at some of the things on the way to the mytho-theological universe, some of the things that might block us in identifying them, we do have to now get closer to the Islamic theo-mythological universe and what Dr. Zamir has contributed. And there we also, he mentions this to some extent, there we also have to be mindful now internally of a significant point, that even within sacred traditions like the Islamic tradition, there are different approaches, of course, to the overarching grand narrative or story, which we are calling myth. This means, for example, that in the Islamic traditions, theologians who have practiced kalam, or the philosophers of falsafa, or for example, the great literary masters, have taken different approaches and highlighted different aspects of Islam's overarching story. The jurists also, for example, right, the fuqaha, they also have focused on different aspects. This means that even internally, forget about those who have in some sense departed from sacred myth and are coming up with their own myths, in terms of moderns who no longer believe in the sacred myths. Even within sacred traditions, within the Islamic traditions, there are multiple dimensions of how we interpret and how we live, of course, the story of Islam. And sometimes it has happened that certain theologians, certain philosophers, certain jurists, and so on, have taken their mode of approach as pretty total, as encompassing. And this has led to some kind of friction, you see, because there is also a totalizing logic which they have used. So they don't talk about certain aspects, they only focus on some. Both externally and internally, when you take a part which is relative and you absolutize it, this leads to a lot of problems. Right? So we're going to look at the same phenomenon here. I'm going to demonstrate this, share one brief hadith with you, which of course most of you are going to be familiar with. I'll just read it, and we'll reflect a little bit on this together. It's the hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam. Okay, we'll just listen to it, and the overriding sense, the comprehensiveness of the tradition, in a sense, comes out, and it is very coherent. It is interconnected. It is a mythical universe with so many aspects integral and integrated in one. So I'll read you, of course, the translation in English. Umar ibn al-Khattab said, one day when we were with God's messenger, peace be upon him, a man with very white clothing and very black hair came up to us. No mark of travel was visible on him, and none of us recognized him. Sitting down before the Prophet, peace be upon him, leaning his knees against his, and placing his hands on his thighs, he said, quote, "Tell me, Muhammad, about submission or Islam." He replied, quote, "Submission or Islam means that you should bear witness that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is God's messenger, and you should perform the ritual prayer, pay the alms tax, fast during Ramadan, and make the pilgrimage to the house if you are able to go there." The man said, quote, "You have spoken the truth," unquote. We were surprised at his questioning him and then declaring that he had spoken the truth. Then he said, "Now tell me about faith or Iman." He, peace be upon him, replied, "Faith or Iman means that you should have faith in God, his angels, his book, his messengers, and the last day, and that you have faith in the measuring out, both its good and its evil," unquote. Remarking that he had spoken the truth, he, the visitor, then said, quote, "Now tell me about doing what is beautiful, or ihsan." He, peace be upon him, replied, "Doing what is beautiful, or ihsan, means that you should worship God as if you see him, for even if you do not see him, he sees you." Then the man said, "Tell me about the hour," and so on and so forth. Okay, now then signs are given about the end of times. Then I'm going to the end now. It says, "Then the man went away. After I had waited for a long time, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said to me, quote, 'Do you know who the questioner was?' Omar, unquote. I replied, quote, 'God and his messenger know best.' And he, peace be upon him, said, quote, 'He was Gabriel, and he came to teach you your,' what is that last word? He came to teach you your
religion.
Your religion. And this is so instructive, because it doesn't say he came to teach you Islam. He says he came to teach you your deen. Of course, pointing to the fact that the three dimensions of Islam, Iman, and Ihsan integrally bound to one another, and none of them in their own limited dimension is the deen. Now, this overarching element, meaning performing the rites and bearing witness in the performing of the rites in terms of the action or the active worship through the bodily actions, but also having faithful trust in that which is not visible to the naked senses. So some of the respondents, when we asked the first question about myth, they said it's not something that you can always see or grasp, let's say physically or empirically. So here we're talking about Iman. And of course then, with full awareness, doing the beautiful in a sense, so that one imagines, it is the as if, it is the imaginal mode of being able to constantly imagine as if you are in the divine presence and in the prophetic presence, so that even if one cannot see it with these physical eyes, one faithfully trusts and imagines that one is actually being seen, that there is presence. And in these senses, when one actually looks at it, it is difficult here, for example, to contend that what is connected here to the sense of deen is not the sense of authentic myth, right? It is something which includes the multiple levels that we saw originally that Guénon was speaking about in terms of authentic myth, not something which is simply a construct of the fallen imagination, but something that leads you back to a full state of presence. So this is one thing which in some sense can help us. Now, as you saw, This, for example, is a very compact version. What we get in the hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam is almost like a prism through which the different dimensions come together. It is synthetic. But is this not, in a certain sense, what Dr. Zamir is now pointing to in his chapter?
Yes.
There is an introduction that Dr. Zamir also wrote to this book, which precedes the first chapter. And I'll mention a brief excerpt of that introduction, okay, as we build a bridge. So as you see, step by step, we're getting into it. The question is, how do we orient ourselves, right, to the authenticity of Islam? Well, he says we do this, Dr. Zamir is saying, he says we do this through the grand narrative of the origins and the end of all things, learning also in the process what transpired between the origin and the end. This grand narrative is the ultimate plot in which all other events, your personal history, your communal history, the global things that are happening, are held to be occurring. It is the sacred story or the mythic story within which Muslims traditionally dwell, live, breathe, discover meaning. And in and through which they find their place and positionality in time and space. It is their web of existence. So authentic myth, in terms of Islamic myth, is like a sacred web in which we exist. It is already imbued with meaning. For Muslims, it is the ultimate story, the divine plot. It is the essential contextual backdrop. The essential contextual backdrop. It gives you the context and it is essential. It is not something which you can simply dispense with, because your entire life is being configured and it is being given meaning through it. Significance is being granted through it. It sets the tone for all things Islamic. And what Dr. Zamir, of course, has done is he has tried to present the overriding sacred myth of the Islamic tradition as a narrative by going to the Quran and telling it as a kind of narratival story, He has decided, of course, to solely, in this chapter that we read together for this session, rely solely on the Quranic revelation, okay, as the orienting story of Muslims. He has done so for a specific reason, because he wants to ask, well, what is Islamic ethics? How can Muslims, or how do Muslims live the good life? Okay, and for that purpose, he has tried to give us all of the different elements that make up the Islamic myth. Now, having read this chapter, you see that it is, in a certain sense, like a divine drama, right? It is a divine drama. But who is the author? This is a fundamental question. This is a fundamental question that arises. By whom is this orienting tale actually authored? There are so many acts, as you see. There is the original moment of manifestation or creation. Then Dr. Zamir in the chapter takes us through the first drama, which involves Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam and the angels, which he calls the angel kings. And what does he name the humans?
Nas.
Right, and how does he translate this?
He talks about
when we talk about nas and when we talk about insan, what is the English translation etymologically that he repeats again and again and again?
The loving, forgetful ones?
Loving, yes.
Yes, mashallah, yes, the loving, forgetful ones. Looking again at the tension etymologically in terms of the words, but also ontologically. Now this, when he does this, he is pointing to something. He is telling us that in the Islamic tradition, through the sacred language, that language means something. It points to true significance. That it's not simply a kind of conjecture, that it is a kind of random. It is a kind of random arbitrary word. But when he says, for example, nas and insan, as the loving, forgetful ones, that they, in some sense, show themselves indeed to be this. He talks about the angel kings. He talks about other creatures and beings. Please.
The word, I would like to describe the word nas. It contains uns and nisyan, which means the loving, and nisyan means the forgetful one.
Right, right, exactly, exactly. And in a certain sense, for the human beings, Dr. Zamir has decided, for example, to use this translation to keep reminding us not to simply use words in a way which is simply functionalist, so that we just say, insan, of course I know what this is. This is an act, this is an exercise in returning to what is already there in the roots, both linguistically, etymologically, but also in terms of reality, in terms of the being of who we truly are. So it is a very intentional move by Dr. Zamir to actually go and not simply say, oh, men or women or insan and so on, but to say, to use this. This is just a very brief point, but this is the kind of exercise. We started with looking at myth in this sense, and now we're going into a sacred myth and seeing that, oh, specific words truly mean symbolically what they really are. So there is a connection rather than a disconnect. He mentions, of course, a whole range of other creatures and beings. Now, should we be surprised and should we wonder at this? What other kinds of beings, aside from the loving, forgetful ones, does he specifically point to when he is describing the Islamic narrative, the narratival myth? What are some of the beings and how does he translate them? So just like Nas and Insan, the loving, forgetful ones, what else do we have? What are some of the key characters in the Islamic sacred myth?
The malaks, the angels.
The angels
Right.
and the jinns.
The angel kings, he calls them, and for the jinn, he translates it as
The hidden ones.
Jinn
The
or
hidden
malaik, the ones, jinns are created with fire and malaiks are created with light, holy light, noor.
Right, right. So already there are also different hierarchies and different positions in the existence which are referred to here. And primarily, in a certain sense, if you had a chance to look at implications, of the tale, you see who or what is the protagonist is sort of the main character.
The devil, shayateen, or shaitan, or I think that was the at the end of the chapter, I think.
Okay, but in terms of, you have so many characters, right? You have so many characters. Now, if we are not really oriented towards sacred myth in terms of its internal coherence, then of course we can take one aspect, and this is, I think, one of the things Dr. Zamir is highlighting. You can simply take one aspect and say, well, for example, if I want to be a successful businessman, how can I improve? I don't know. How can I improve profits compared to last year? You can take a certain aspect by dismissing the entire myth that he has presented. So what I'm asking is, we have angels, or the angel kings. We have the hidden ones. We have the loving, forgetful ones. And then, of course, we have the one who is the author of the entire narrative, right? Who plays the central role? And what is the central challenge? What is the great dilemma of this sacred myth? There has to be some kind of conflict. There has to be some kind of quest, right? There has to be some kind of quest. What is the great quest which is being communicated through the way that Dr. Zamir is telling the tale? What is the great quest? Can someone perhaps summarize or formulate this? What lies at the center of this great narrative?
Initially, the angels and jinns did not accept the creation of man. They argumented that oh Lord, you have created man from light clay of dark mud, and we are created from fire and noor. But the Malaik obeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to pay sajda in front of Adam alayhi salam. But the jinns refused and the argument started.
Right, right. So this is definitely, this highlights one of these initial moments of tension in the drama. This is a very primary moment. And this, along with many of the other key moments that Dr. Zamir is highlighting in this great myth, right, in some sense perhaps point to something.
So I think
it is pointing.
Sorry. I think it's getting to the origination point where everything originates. I think it's a quest to go back to where we came from, or where everything came from. So going to the root of everything. I think that's
right.
Or it may be about the aspect of knowledge which Allah has put into the heart of Adam, that He has taught him the names of the things and the ilm, the knowledge which Malaik and Jinn did not have that much access to them.
Right, right. Okay, so both of you, mashallah, you're focusing very much on that center or the original, let's say the original moment of the drama in terms of the human-divine interaction, and some of these other metaphysical and ontological beings are also coming into view. But as you see, there are also reverberations. There are also echoes, let's say, through sacred history of Islam. But a few of the implications, if we can jump perhaps to the second part of Dr. Zamir's, do you see where it says implications of the myth? Part 2, implications of the orienting tale. So there are four or five points that he makes in terms of the great implications of this. And that might help us to respond to the question. Because the implications of the great myth, especially when it comes to the sacred Islamic myth, cannot be disconnected in the way that the myths of the modern age, as Wolfgang Smith was talking about, pseudo or anti-myths. Much the actions or the rituals that we perform in society can very much be disconnected and have nothing to do with the original sacred myths, for example, of Judaism and Christianity. You have a kind of post-Christian and post-Jewish mode of operation in the world. In the example that I cited for you from The Synthetic Age, this book by the MIT professor, you do not hear of these beings, do you? You do not hear of jinn, you do not hear of angel kings, right? And you do not, of course, hear of insan, right, as someone who has pacts or has covenants with an overarching, all-powerful, all-merciful Lord. So those things are taken out. In this case, the implications are very directly contained already in the story itself because it is organic and comprehensive. So if we go to page 20 and 21 are instructive for us. If you can please look at page 20 and 21 in terms of the implications, right, of this comprehensive myth of Islamic tradition. For one, Muslims, of course, believe that when we speak about life, right, do not simply mean the everyday in terms of its closed boundaries, and we do not mean something abstract, but it is two intertwined, nested modes in terms of the life of this world, the dunya, and also akhirah, which extends beyond before and after, in a certain sense, of the worldly life. So this is one implication, that it orients, when we read the stories, with the multitudes of existence, and in terms of eternity, we therefore do not subscribe only to the everyday or to a historicism. This is one great implication. The second thing is that the question of what it means to be a human being also is affected by this myth. Because in terms of the covenants that are made, when the Lord asks all to be created humanity, mine not your, the response is or covenant on the day of Alastu, which is not a historical moment, as orienting actually my purpose and function through the worldly life also. So it's one of both vicegerency and being a representative on the earth, but also one of servanthood. Now, in the contemporary speech, it has been referred to as servant leadership, that each human being, in a certain sense, when you look at sacred tradition, is defined as a sacred, as a servant leader, both as abd, right, and as khalifa. So some of these elements are also as a second implication. A third implication is that, in a certain sense, each thing has its place on the journey. So the relationship with other humans, the relationship with other creatures, both plant, animal, and others, the relationship with the world of the jinn, and of course with the world of the angel kings, right? All things are coherently communicating and integrated. And it is not simply conjecture and randomness. It is a harmonious universe. This is another great implication. Things have sense because of the position and role they play. There is a nazm, which is the cosmic aspect, of course. The fourth implication, he says that there is a challenge, a quest, or a trial to travel on the path of return to the Lord, and the great prophets and their communities to whom they were sent, of course, receive revelation to remind us of how to actually travel on this quest and on this journey. So this is also a fundamental implication. The purpose of why are we simply here? What is our purpose? It helps the great story, the great myth, informs and imbues our life with meaning. Last but not least, the relationship with other communities, of course, meaning we are not told that there is only one community and that the Muslim community is historically bound to itself. But the universal notion of prophecy means that if prophets are sent by the Lord to every single community, then we have an obligation to then also communicate and find the best way of communicating with other guided communities. So these fundamentally orient the life of a Muslim passing through the dunya, help us consider our origin, where did we come from, why are we here, where are we going, in a way that the modern anti-myths, as Wolfgang Smith was saying, do not quite do. So I'll leave it there. So Sidi Taimur has informed me that we only have very few minutes left for questions and comments. Bismillah.
Okay, it's on page 17, and
Page
there's
17.
a line which, yes, there's a line which I just don't understand. It's after this, called the seal of prophets by the Quran. It's the third line. He is the one who was not sent by the Lord of the worlds, save as mercy to the worlds. I just don't understand what, I mean, in what reference. He talks about the prophet, of course, that he was sent to us as a messenger, and then he goes on, and without the context of whose life, it is difficult to understand the Quran. He is the one who was not sent by the Lord of the worlds, save as mercy to the worlds. Just boggles my mind. I don't know what it's relating to. I mean, in what sense?
Okay. Well, I mean, first of all, just the surface notion of the language. So he was sent as a mercy to the worlds. He was sent as nothing but a mercy to all of the worlds. So save here means
Okay.
accept, right? Accept. So he
Accept.
wasn't sent for any other purpose, so to say,
But
as being a mercy to all the worlds.
okay, okay,
It's a
got it.
rahmah for the alameen, not just this one world or what
It's
we
for
believe to
both
be
the
this
worlds.
world, but all from the beginning to end.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you.
You're most welcome.
Alhamdulillah, that was very nice.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.
No, thank you for being here. And inshallah, if there are questions or requests for also the texts that were mentioned, that can be also forwarded.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Khuda Hafiz.
All the best to you. Yes. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you. Khuda.